Margaret Hale didn't scream when she fell. She twisted her body so she landed on her side, both arms clutching the two bundles against her chest, taking the full impact on her shoulder, so the babies felt nothing. That was the last thing she did before the cold swallowed her whole. She had walked 19 miles in a January blizzard with two 6-week-old infants and no shoes that fit anymore. She wasn't looking for a hero. She was looking for somewhere to die that wasn't the middle of the road. If this story moves you, subscribe to my channel and follow every part to the end. Drop the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Elias Greer saw the shape in the snow from 100 yards out and pulled his horse to a dead stop. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't fall that way. Arms first curled inward, protecting something. He'd seen enough dead men on enough battlefields to know the difference between something that dropped and something that chose where it landed. He didn't dismount right away. 5 years alone on the Montana range had taught him that caution kept you breathing. He scanned the tree line, the road, the ridge to the north. Nothing moved, just wind and white and that shape in the snow that wasn't moving either. All right. He said it to nobody, swung down from the saddle and walked. She was young, mid-20s at most. Dark hair frozen against her cheek. Her dress was gray wool soaked through, and she had a coat that might have been warm in October, but was a death sentence in January. Her lips were blue. Her boots were tied together with rope because the soles had split clean off. And pressed against her chest, one on each side, bundled in what looked like strips torn from a man's shirt, were two infants. Newborns. 6 weeks, maybe 8. Both alive. One was asleep. The other was staring up at the gray sky with enormous dark eyes, too cold and too exhausted to cry. Eli dropped to his knees. "Ma'am." He pressed 2 fingers to her throat. A pulse, thin as thread, but there. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids moved, not much. Enough. "My babies." Her voice came out cracked, barely sound at all. "Please, my babies first." "They're here. They're with you, both of them." James. A breath. "Rose. I got them. I got all 3 of you." Eli pulled his coat off without thinking, wrapped it around all of them, in one motion, mother and both children together. The cold hit him like a fist to the sternum, but he didn't stop moving. "I need you to stay awake. Can you do that for me?" She didn't answer. "Ma'am." He put his hand on her face, turned her toward him. Her eyes found his, and he saw something there that hit him somewhere deep and unguarded. Not fear, not hope, just pure exhausted determination. The look of someone who has already decided they will not give up and is simply waiting for their body to agree. "What's your name?" "Maggie." A pause. "Hale." "Eli Greer. My cabin's 2 miles west. Can you ride if I hold you?" "I can't." She coughed. "I can't let go of them." "You won't have to." He stood, got his arms under her. She was lighter than she should have been. A woman who hadn't eaten in days, maybe longer. "Hold on to them, I'll hold on to you." Getting 3 people onto one horse in a blizzard was not something Eli had ever trained for. He managed it by brute will and a complete refusal to think about what happened if he didn't. He climbed up. First pulled Maggie in front of him, her back against his chest. Both infants pressed between them. He could feel them breathing through 3 layers of wool. That feeling 2 small lives against his ribs did something to him he didn't have words for. He didn't try to find words. He just rode. The cabin was cold when they got there. He'd let the fire go low that morning, and it had gone out entirely while he was checking the north fence line. He got Maggie inside, laid her on the bed, kept both babies tucked against her, because her body heat, thin as it was warmer than the air in the room. He rebuilt the fire with hands that shook from cold. Not fear, he told himself, and then he went to work. Water. He had a barrel in the corner, not frozen yet. He got a cup to her lips before she fully woke. Small sips. He held her head up. Don't rush it. She drank. Choked. Drank more. Her eyes opened wider, taking in the ceiling, the walls, his face above hers. He watched her run through the calculation every woman in her position ran. Who is this man? What does he want? How bad is this going to be? And he stayed very still and let her look. Where are they? Not a question. Her arms tightened. Right here, both of them. Neither one cried the whole ride. He reached over, adjusted the bundle on her right side so she could see James's face. The boy had gone back to sleep. That one's got your stubbornness already. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile. Not quite not a smile. Rose. She shifted, looked at the left bundle. The girl was awake, dark eyes blinking slowly. She's the quiet one. She's the one who was watching the sky when I found you. Maggie looked at Rose for a long moment, then back at Eli. How far did you carry us? 2 miles. In a blizzard. Wasn't a full blizzard yet. He moved to the stove, started opening tins. He had beans, salt pork hardtack that had been soft once, and wasn't anymore. It got worse after. Why did you stop? Her voice was careful, flat in the way of someone who has learned not to sound like they're hoping. Most men don't stop. Eli didn't answer right away. He measured water into a pot, set it to boil. You didn't fall like someone who gave up, he said finally. You fell protecting those babies. That's not a woman I ride past. Silence from the bed. I can't pay you. Her voice cracked on the last word just slightly. I don't have money, don't have papers, don't have anything worth. Didn't ask for payment. Then what do you want? He turned around. She was sitting up now, both babies still held against her chest, watching him with eyes that had learned to be suspicious of generosity. He understood that look. He'd worn it himself for 3 years after Sarah died. I want you to eat something, he said. And I want those babies warm. Beyond that, I don't want a thing. Maggie studied him. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't find the bad version of it. All right, she said. All right. She ate everything he put in front of her quickly, without speaking the way people eat when they're not sure when the next meal is coming. He didn't comment on it. He brought more. When the babies started fussing, she tried to nurse them both at once and couldn't quite manage it, and she looked at him with the first real flash of something other than exhaustion, embarrassment maybe. And he stood up, immediately, turned his back, busied himself at the stove until she said she was done. You got a way of making yourself scarce at the right moment, she said. I got 3 sisters. He turned back around. I learned. That made her pause. You're from a big family. Was. He pulled the other chair to the fire, sat. Just me now. She looked down at the babies. James had fallen asleep nursing. Rose was still at it, small fist closed around Maggie's finger. And them. My husband died in October. Mine collapsed outside of Billings. I was 7 months along. She said it plain like a fact she'd already made peace with, but her jaw went tight on the last words. He never saw them. Eli was quiet. I've been walking since November. Maggie's voice stayed even. Had a cousin in Bozeman who said she'd take us in. She didn't. A pause. Had a job lined up at a boarding house in Harlow Creek. Owner took one look at the babies and said he didn't hire encumbrances. Encumbrances. Eli said the word like it tasted bad. His word. Maggie looked up. I've been called worse in the last 3 months. What have they called you? She met his eyes. Burden? Trash? Too proud for my situation. Not proud enough. She lifted her chin. Every town I've passed through has had an opinion about what a widow with 2 newborns ought to be. None of them offered to help, just opinions. What do you think you ought to be? She blinked, like the question surprised her. Alive, she said finally. I think I ought to be alive. I think they ought to be alive. She looked at James and Rose. That's all I've been thinking about for 3 months. Just alive. Eli nodded slowly. Then you're in the right place, because alive is something I can help with. She slept before he finished the sentence. He moved both babies to the drawer he'd pulled from the dresser and lined with blankets. An old rancher's trick he'd seen his mother do with the runt of a litter, once the same principle: keep the small ones close and warm and together. James didn't stir. Rose opened her eyes when he set her down, looked at him with that steady, watchful gaze, and then closed them again. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his rifle across his knees, and watched the door until morning. The next day, she was stronger. Not strong nobody walked 19 miles through a blizzard with 2 newborns, and was strong the next day, but her eyes were clearer, and she moved around the cabin with a quiet efficiency that told him she was used to doing things herself. "You don't have to hover," she said, catching him watching her from the doorway. "I'm not hovering. I live here. You've checked on me 4 times in the last hour. The babies are fine." She turned to face him. She was holding Rose against her shoulder, patting the baby's back with a steady rhythm. "Mr. Greer, I appreciate what you did. I do. But I'm not made of glass, and I've been keeping these 2 alive for 6 weeks without help. I know what I'm doing." "I didn't say you didn't. You didn't have to." Something in her voice wasn't unkind, just direct. "What I need from you is information, not watching. Where's the nearest town? Who's the law here? Is there work to be had come spring?" Eli pulled out the chair at the table. "Sit down and I'll tell you everything." She sat. He sat across from her. Rose gurgled against her shoulder. The nearest town was Harlan's Crossing, 8 miles east. Sheriff there was a man named Roy Tanner. Decent enough on the surface, Roy Tanner, but in Roy Tanner's back pocket was a hand that belonged to Aldous Vane, and Aldous Vane was a name that changed the air in the room when Eli said it. "Who is he?" Maggie asked. "Owns the bank, owns the general store, owns half the grazing rights in the territory." Eli's voice went flat. "What he don't own, he finds a way to acquire. Is he dangerous?" Eli looked at her steadily. "He's the kind of dangerous that wears a suit and quotes law at you while he's taking everything you have, which is worse than the other kind, because the other kind you can see coming." Maggie was quiet for a moment, rocking Rose slowly. "Has he come after you?" "3 times. Eli set his jaw. "Wants the water rights on this property. I got a spring that don't dry up even in drought years. He's offered to buy me out. I said no. He sent lawyers. I said no. He sent Tanner with a questionable deed from a property dispute 6 years back." A pause. "I said no to that too." "And he stopped." "He ain't the kind that stops." Eli looked out the window. "He's the kind that waits." Maggie absorbed this. James made a sound from the drawer, not crying, just announcing himself, and she crossed to him, picked him up, held both babies now, one on each arm, with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it long enough that it felt natural. Eli watched her manage both children at once, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite grief. Something in between. "How long can we stay?" Maggie asked. She was looking at James, not at him. Her voice was careful again, that flat tone that meant she was bracing for the answer. "Long as you need." She looked up. "That's not an answer most men give." "It's the only one I've got." She studied him the same way she had when he found her on the road, running that calculation behind her eyes. Then she nodded once and went back to the babies. The trouble started on the 3rd day. It came in the form of a rider. Eli saw him from the barn, a man he recognized, Pete Sallow, who ran errands for anyone who paid him enough, which meant he ran errands for Aldous Vane. Eli came out of the barn before Sallow reached the porch. "Something I can help you with." Sallow pulled up short. He had the look of a man who didn't enjoy delivering bad news. "Mr. Greer, heard you had visitors." "Word travels fast for 8 miles of blizzard. Mr. Vane has ears." Sallow shifted in the saddle. "He wanted me to tell you the woman you picked up on the Billings Road, he knows who she is." Eli went very still. "She's a widow with 2 infants who nearly froze to death. That's who she is." "Mr. Vane says her name is Margaret Hale. Says she left Billings owing a debt to a man named Cooper, merchant. Claims she took goods on credit and disappeared without paying. Her husband died in October. She had a 6-week-old babies and no money. What kind of man presses debt on that? The kind who sells the debt to Mr. Vane. Sallow had the grace to look uncomfortable. He's got paperwork, Mr. Greer, signed and witnessed. Says the debt transfers to goods and property in lieu of coin. Says he's got the legal right to collect what's owed. What goods? What property? She came to me with nothing but those children. Sallow looked away. The children count as property under the "Get off my land." Eli's voice went so quiet, it was almost nothing. Right now, get off my land, and you tell Vane that nobody is collecting anything from this property. Not today, not ever. Mr. Greer. Now. Sallow went. Eli stood in the cold until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then he walked inside. Maggie was standing in the middle of the room. She'd heard everything through the window. He could tell by the color of her face, not white with shock, but gray with recognition, the look of someone hearing something they'd been afraid of for a long time. "The debt is a lie," she said. "I never bought a thing from any man named Cooper on credit. I paid cash for everything I bought because I knew if I owed anyone anything, I'd never get out of Billings." "I believe you. Then why doesn't that make me feel better?" Her voice shook on the last word just slightly. Both babies were in the drawer asleep. She didn't go to them. She stood in the middle of the floor with her arms at her sides like she was forcing herself not to reach for them. "He's going to use them, isn't he? That's what the paperwork is for." Eli crossed to her. He stopped 2 feet away, close enough to be heard clearly. "Listen to me. You're on my land, my property. Whatever paperwork Vane has, it doesn't apply here. For how long?" Her eyes found his. "He'll get Tanner. He'll get a judge. He's done this before. You can see it in how fast he moved, how clean the paperwork is. He's done this before and he knows exactly how to make it legal." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "They'll say I abandoned them, or that I'm unfit. A widow, no money, living on a man's charity." "You're not living on charity. What am I living on? Shelter from a storm." Eli held her gaze. "Same as any person on the road has a right to." Maggie looked at him for a long time. Her jaw was set, her eyes fierce and wet at once, the combination of a woman who refuses to cry and knows she's close to it. "I won't let them take my children," she said. "I want you to understand that, whatever happens. I won't let anyone take James and Rose. Nobody is taking them. You can't promise that." "No." He held her gaze. "But I can promise that anybody who tries is going to have to go through me first. And I'm harder to go through than I look." Something in Maggie's face shifted. Not relief, she was too smart for relief this early. But something, like a door that had been sealed shut, had opened just a crack. "Why?" she asked. "You don't know me. You found me in a ditch 3 days ago. Why would you fight for us?" Eli was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower, rougher, like he was pulling the words from somewhere he didn't go very often. "Because 6 years ago, somebody should have fought for my wife, and I wasn't there to do it. She was alone and scared, and she needed help, and there wasn't anybody." He stopped. Started again. "I can't fix that. But I can be here now. That's all I know how to do." Maggie didn't speak. From the drawer came a small sound, Rose making the soft inquiring noise that meant she was waking up. Maggie crossed to her, picked her up, held her against her chest. Then she looked back at Eli over the baby's head, and she said, "Then we better figure out what we're going to do, because Vane isn't going to wait long." Outside, the wind had started again, another storm coming down from the north. But inside the cabin, the fire was hot. The babies were breathing, and for the first time in 3 months, Maggie Hale wasn't facing what was coming alone. Vane didn't send Sallow back. That was the first sign something worse was coming. Eli knew the man's patterns. 3 years of watching Aldous Vane operate in Harlan's Crossing had taught him that when Vane went quiet, he wasn't retreating. He was building. Stacking paperwork, buying testimony, greasing the right palms until what he wanted looked legal enough to hold up in front of whatever judge owed him a favor that week. The quiet lasted 2 days. On the morning of the third day, Eli rode into town. He didn't tell Maggie where he was going. He told her he needed supplies, which was true enough, and he told her to bar the door from the inside and not open it for anyone, which she did without argument. She'd already figured out that arguments with Eli Greer on matters of safety were a waste of breath she didn't have to spare. She had 2 infants and 1 free hand at any given moment. She chose her battles. The general store was half empty when Eli walked in. Harold Beckett was behind the counter, sorting tin cans, with the slow, careful movements of a man who'd hurt his back and hadn't fully healed. He looked up when Eli came through the door and immediately looked back down at the cans. "Morning, Eli." "Harold." Eli set his list on the counter. "You heard anything from Vane lately?" Harold's hands slowed on the cans. "I hear things from Vane every day. Man owns the building I'm standing in. About the woman at my place." Harold set a can down very precisely. "Eli, don't ask me things that are going to put me sideways with Vane. I got 3 kids and a bad back and I can't afford—" "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm asking you what you heard." A long pause. Harold looked at the door, then back. "He's got a judge coming in from Helena. Man named Whitfield. Ride Circuit owes Vane money from a land deal 2 years back." He dropped his voice. "Vane's putting together a case. Abandonment. He's going to say she abandoned those babies when she left Billings without proper means to care for them. She nearly died trying to care for them." "Eli." Harold finally met his eyes. "I know that. You know that. But Vane's got 3 men willing to swear they saw her leave Billings with the babies, and no plan, no money, nothing. He's going to say she was reckless, unfit, that she endangered them deliberately." His voice dropped further. "The paperwork says temporary guardianship goes to a family of the court's choosing pending investigation. And who does the court choose?" Harold didn't answer. He didn't need to. His brother. Eli said it flat, already knowing. "Isaiah Vane and his wife can't have children of their own. Aldous has been trying to fix that for years." Harold went back to his cans. "I didn't tell you nothing." "You didn't tell me a thing." Eli picked up his order and left. He found Isaiah Cole at the livery the way he usually did, mid-morning. Isaiah was 70 years old, had been in the Montana Territory longer than most people's fathers, and had forgotten more about Aldous Vane's history than anyone else in Harlan's Crossing had ever learned. He was also the only man in town that Vane had never successfully bought, threatened, or outmaneuvered, mostly because Isaiah Cole had nothing left to lose and everyone knew it. "Heard you got company," Isaiah said without looking up from the harness he was mending. "Word travels." "Always does." Isaiah bit off a thread. "2 babies, they're saying. Twins. Not identical. Boy and a girl." Isaiah made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "And Vane's circling. Judge Whitfield's coming in." Isaiah set the harness down, then looked at Eli directly. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen a great many things and been surprised by very few of them. "How's the mother? Stronger than she should be after what she walked through. Smart. Doesn't scare easy." Eli paused. "She knows what's coming. She's not running. She'd be a fool to run. Running gives Vane exactly what he needs, confirms abandonment, confirms instability." Isaiah picked the harness back up. "She's got to fight it legal, which means she needs someone who knows the law, and she needs witnesses, and she needs time." He looked sideways at Eli. "How much time you think Vane's going to give her?" "Not much." "Then you better start moving." Eli rode back to the cabin with his supplies and a weight in his chest that hadn't been there that morning. Maggie met him at the door before he'd fully dismounted. She'd heard the horse coming and she'd already unbarred the door, already had Rose on her hip and James in the crook of her other arm, already read something in his face from 30 feet away. "Tell me," she said. He told her at the table, both babies between them, in the drawer he'd moved to the kitchen, the fire going strong at their backs. He told her everything Harold had said, and everything Isaiah had confirmed, and he watched her face while he talked. She didn't flinch, She didn't cry. She asked two questions: who was Whitfield, and when was he due? And when he answered both, she was quiet for almost a full minute. The abandonment charge, she said finally. He's going to say I left Billings with no means to care for them. Yes, I left Billings because I had no means to stay in Billings. My husband's wages stopped when he died. The mining company gave me a week's pay as condolence and told me the company housing had to be vacated. I had 2 newborns and $7 and no family within 400 miles. Her voice was even, controlled. The voice of a woman reciting facts so she doesn't have to feel them right now. I wasn't reckless. I was the only option they had. I know that. Can we prove it? Eli looked at her. We can try. Do you have anything from Billings' letters receipts? Anything with your name and your husband's? She was quiet. Then she reached into the front of her dress. He looked away and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She set it on the table. He looked back. It was a death certificate. Thomas Aaron Hale, age 31, killed in a mining collapse on October the 14th, survived by his wife Margaret and 2 children. I've had it against my skin since the day they gave it to me, she said. Figured it was the only thing that proved we were real. That he was real. That this wasn't just... She stopped. That we weren't just 2 strays somebody found in the snow. Eli looked at the paper for a moment. This is something. It's not everything, but it's something. He folded it carefully, pushed it back toward her. Keep it where you had it, safest place. She tucked it away without looking at him. What else do we need? Witnesses. People who can testify to your character. The problem is, you haven't been in this territory long enough for anyone to know you. He drummed his fingers on the table. Isaiah Cole might speak for you. His word carries weight, even with a circuit judge. And there's Ruth Pryor, runs the boarding house on the south end of town. She's had run-ins with Vane over property before. She'd be motivated. You'd ask them to risk Vane's anger for a woman they've never met. I'd ask them to do what's right for 2 babies who didn't choose any of this. Maggie looked at him. That calculating look again, but softer this time. Like she was revising her estimate of him upward and wasn't sure how to account for the difference. You believe in people, she said. Like it surprised her. I believe in some people. After everything Vane's done to this town, Vane's one man. Eli leaned forward, elbows on the table. He's loud, and he's got money, and he's been running things here long enough that people forgot what it felt like not to be scared of him. But he's one man, and one man can be stopped if enough other people decide they're done letting him run. He paused. I've been deciding that for 3 years on my own. I just needed a reason to do something about it. Maggie looked at James and Rose in the drawer. James was asleep with one fist tucked under his chin. Rose was awake watching the firelight the way she always did, patient and observant, nothing like her brother. They're your reason, Maggie said quietly. Aren't they? They're part of it. She looked back at him. Whatever the rest of it was, neither of them said it. The knock at the door came just before dark. Eli was on his feet with his rifle before the second knock landed. He put himself between the door and the table where Maggie sat and said loud and flat, "Who's there?" Ruth Pryor. A woman's voice, brisk and no nonsense. Isaiah Cole sent me. Said you might need talking to. Eli looked at Maggie. She nodded once. He opened the door. Ruth Pryor was a woman somewhere in her late 50s, built like someone who had spent their entire life doing physical work and had made peace with that. She had gray hair pinned back severely, and eyes that took in the whole room in one sweep, landed on the babies, and went immediately soft before going hard again. 2 of them, she said. Yes, ma'am, Maggie said. Boy and a girl, James and Rose. Ruth walked to the table without being invited, looked down into the drawer, made a sound in her throat that was somewhere between grief and fury. How old? 6 weeks, near 7. And you walked how far in January? 19 miles the last day. More before that. Ruth straightened up, looked at Eli. Isaiah says Vane's got Whitfield coming. End of the week, we think. Then we don't have much time. She pulled out the chair across from Maggie and sat down with the authority of a woman who has run a household and a business simultaneously for 30 years and has learned that hesitation costs more than it saves. My name is Ruth Pryor. Vane tried to buy my boarding house 4 years ago. I said no. He tried to have me investigated for operating without a proper license. I said go ahead and investigate. He sent 2 men to lean on me. She paused. I sent them back to him with their feelings hurt and a formal complaint with the Territorial Marshal's office. A beat. Nothing came of the complaint, but Vane's left me alone since. He doesn't like women who write things down. She looked at Maggie. Are you a woman who writes things down? I can be. Good. Then we're going to document everything. Every conversation, every threat, every visit from Sallow or Tanner or anyone else Vane sends. We're going to write it down with dates and witnesses, and we're going to have it ready when Whitfield arrives. She folded her hands on the table. I'll speak for you at the hearing. Isaiah will speak. Harold Beckett will speak if we catch him on the right day, and his conscience is louder than his fear. She looked at Eli. And you'll speak. Of course. Your word carries weight with Whitfield. I don't know Whitfield. No, but you've got a clean record and a deed to this property that's been uncontested for 6 years. That counts for something. Ruth looked back at Maggie. What I need from you is the truth. All of it. Everything that happened in Billings. Everything that happened on the road. Everything Vane's man said when he came here. Can you give me that? I've got nothing to hide. Good, because Vane is going to dig for something. If there's nothing there, he'll make something up, but a fabrication is easier to fight than the truth used against you. Ruth pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket. An actual notebook worn at the corners half full of writing already. Start from the beginning. Thomas Hale, The Mine, October. Maggie started talking. She talked for an hour. Her voice stayed steady through most of it, cracked once when she described the week after Thomas died, the company man who'd come to tell her she had 7 days to vacate the housing, who'd handed her the $7, with the particular careful politeness of someone performing a transaction they found distasteful but not wrong. She steadied herself and kept going. Ruth wrote. She didn't offer comfort, didn't make sympathetic sounds, didn't tell Maggie she was brave or strong, or that everything would be fine. She just wrote, asked sharp, clarifying questions, and wrote some more. Eli found himself deeply grateful for this. When Maggie finished, Ruth closed the notebook and looked at her for a long moment. You know what Vane's real argument is going to be, Ruth said. It wasn't a question. That I'm living here. Maggie's voice was careful. With a man I'm not married to. Yes. The word sat in the room. Eli looked at the fire. He heard Maggie take a breath. He heard her let it out. I'll go to town, Maggie said. Before Whitfield arrives. I'll stay at your boarding house if you'll have us. Take myself out of the equation. No. Eli said it without thinking, then said it again more deliberately. No. You leave this property, Vane's men will find a way to separate you from those babies before you make it to Ruth's front door. You're safe here. You stay here. And the argument about impropriety. Let Vane make it. Weak men hide behind propriety when they've got nothing real to fight with. Ruth was watching both of them with an expression that was carefully neutral. She stood, buttoned her coat. I'll talk to Isaiah tonight. We'll have a plan by morning. She looked at Maggie one more time. You're tougher than you think you are. I know how tough I am, Maggie said quietly. I just don't know if it's enough. Ruth left without answering that. The door closed. The cabin went quiet except for the fire and the small sounds of 2 babies sleeping. Maggie sat at the table for a while after Ruth left, not moving, both hands flat on the wood. Eli stayed where he was. He'd learned in the past several days that she needed to come to the edge of things on her own terms, that reaching out too soon only made her pull back. She didn't tell me it would be all right, Maggie said finally. Ruth doesn't lie. No? A pause. I respect that. She looked up at him. Her eyes were tired in the deep bone way of someone who had been tired for months and had stopped noticing it except in moments like this. Eli, your wife, what happened to her? He hadn't expected the question. He stayed quiet for a moment. Fever, he said. Winter of '79. I was in Helena filing a land claim. She was alone for 5 days. He stopped. By the time I got back, she'd been gone 2 days. Maggie didn't say she was sorry. He was glad. He was tired of people being sorry. Her name was Sarah, he said. It was the first time he'd said her name out loud to anyone in over a year. It still fit the shape of his mouth the same way it always had. She would have told you the same thing Ruth told you. Straight, no softening. He looked at Maggie. She would have liked you. Maggie's jaw worked for a moment. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it. James shifted in the drawer and made a sound of protest at being jostled by his own movement. Maggie was up before the sound fully formed, had him in her arms before he could wake Rose. She bounced him gently, and he settled, and she stood there in the firelight holding her son with her eyes closed and her face doing something complicated and private. Eli got up quietly and went out to check the horses. He stood in the dark for a long time, the cold working through his coat, the way it always did in January, thinking about Ruth's notebook and Harold's face and the particular way Maggie had said she knew how tough she was. He thought about what Isaiah had said, that Vane didn't give time, that they had to move first, and he thought about the thing he hadn't said out loud yet. The thing he was beginning to understand was true, which was that this had stopped being about doing the right thing for a stranger somewhere around the second day, and had become something else entirely, something he didn't have a name for yet and wasn't sure he deserved. The door opened behind him. It's too cold to think out here, Maggie said. Whatever you're working through, come inside and work through it by the fire. He turned. She was standing in the doorway, coat pulled over her shoulders, both babies apparently settled. Her breath made small clouds in the January dark. He walked back to the cabin. She held the door open for him, and when he passed her on the threshold, she said very quietly, not looking at him, "Thank you. For today. For Ruth. For all of it." "We ain't done yet," he said. "No." She let the door close behind them. "But we're not done alone. That's different." She was right. That was different. And when Tanner's horse appeared on the ridge at first light the next morning, moving slow and deliberate, the way trouble always moved when it wanted to look legal, Eli was already standing on the porch, rifle in hand, waiting. Tanner rode alone, which meant he wasn't there to take anyone. Not yet. A man who came alone in the morning with a badge on his chest and no deputies behind him was delivering a message, not making an arrest. Eli kept the rifle where it was anyway. Tanner pulled up 20 feet from the porch and stayed in the saddle, which was a courtesy of sorts. It meant he wasn't planning to stay long enough to tie up his horse. Greer. Tanner. The deputy marshal had the face of a man who had made too many compromises over too many years and had stopped being troubled by any individual one of them. He wasn't cruel exactly. He was something worse. He was practical. "Judge Whitfield arrives tomorrow," he said. "Hearing set for 10 in the morning. Vane's office, second floor of the bank." Vane's office. Eli let that sit for a moment. Impartial setting. It's what the judge agreed to. Tanner's eyes moved to the cabin door, then back. The woman needs to present herself. Voluntarily. If she don't show it, goes forward without her, and the outcome won't be favorable. The outcome isn't going to be favorable regardless, and everybody standing here knows it. Tanner's jaw worked. "I'm just delivering the notice, Eli. I know what you're doing." Eli stepped down off the porch, came close enough to lower his voice. "Roy, you remember what this town was like before Vane. You were deputy under Carter. You remember what it felt like to do this job clean." Something moved across Tanner's face, something he put away quickly. "That was a long time ago." "It wasn't that long. Long enough." Tanner pulled his horse's head around. 10 o'clock. "If she don't show a warrant, goes out, and I've got no choice but to execute it." He didn't look back when he said the next part. "Bring the Cowboy's testimony if you got it. Whitfield respects Isaiah Cole, even if Vane don't. He rode off. Eli stood where he was for a moment. Then he went inside. Maggie was at the table. She'd heard everything through the door, and her face told him she understood all of it. Both babies were in the drawer, James asleep, and Rose conducting her usual silent audit of the ceiling. "Vane's office," she said. "Yes. He wants me on his ground. His room, his furniture, his judge looking down at me from whatever height he arranges." She folded her hands on the table. Her knuckles were white. "He wants me to feel small before anyone says a word. Then we make sure you don't feel small." Eli sat across from her. "You've been in worse rooms than Aldous Vane's office." "I've been in a mining company administrator's office explaining why I couldn't vacate company housing with 2 newborns in January." Her voice was flat. "You're right. I have been in worse rooms." He rode to Ruth's before noon. Ruth had already heard Ruth. Already heard it was one of her most useful qualities, and she had Isaiah Cole sitting at her kitchen table when Eli arrived, along with Harold Beckett, who was turning his hat in his hands, the way he always did when his conscience was winning an argument with his fear. "Whitfield's a real judge," Isaiah said before Eli sat down. "Not one of Vane's puppets. He owes Vane money, but he's got a reputation to protect and he knows it. That's our opening." "What's our argument?" Eli asked. "Truth," Ruth said, setting coffee in front of him. "Plain and documented. The death certificate, the timeline from Billings to here, the condition she arrived in and the condition she's in now." She sat. "I've written out a statement, 3 pages. Isaiah is signing it. Harold is signing it." She looked at Harold. Harold looked at his hat. Then he looked up. "I'm signing it," he said. "Vane's going to make my life miserable for it, but—" He stopped. "My wife said if I didn't sign it, she'd make my life more miserable than Vane ever could." The ghost of something crossed his face. "She's probably right." "What about Tanner?" Eli asked. "Tanner won't testify for Vane," Isaiah said. "But he won't testify against him either. He'll stay neutral and hope the whole thing resolves itself." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "What worries me is the Cooper debt, the paperwork Vane's got. Even if it's forged, it looks legitimate. Whitfield's going to look at it, and we need to be ready to challenge it." "How do we challenge it?" "Cooper's dead," Ruth said. "Died last spring, they say. Convenient." She looked at Eli steadily. "But a man doesn't create a debt and forge a transfer document overnight. He had to have help. Someone witnessed the signatures. Someone filed the transfer at the county seat. If the filing's fraudulent, it's a crime. A real one, not a civil matter. Which means it's bigger than Whitfield's jurisdiction and goes federal." Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "Vane doesn't want federal attention. He's got operations in 4 counties that wouldn't survive a federal look." Eli looked at him. "You know that for certain." "I know it for 70 years of watching how men like Vane operate." Isaiah set his cup down. "The threat of federal review is our lever. We don't have to prove the forgery today. We just have to raise enough questions that Whitfield decides the safest thing for his own reputation is to delay." He paused. "A delay gives us time to get real evidence. And Vane's position weakens with time. He needs this done fast and quiet. Every day it isn't done fast and quiet is a day that works against him." Eli rode back to the cabin with a strategy that felt thinner than he'd have liked and no better option. Maggie listened to all of it without interrupting. "Federal review," she said when he finished. "If Whitfield thinks the debt transfer was fraudulently filed with the county, he delays. Vane doesn't get his quick legal resolution." She nodded slowly. "It's not a win. It's a door held open. It's the best door we've got." She was quiet for a moment. "I need to tell you something." She looked at her hands. "I didn't tell Ruth everything last night. There was a man in Billings. After Thomas died, he worked for the mining company. Middle management handled the administrative side of the accident claims." She paused. "He came to see me 3 times. Said he could help me get more than the $7 from the company. Said he had influence, knew the right people." She stopped again. "The 3rd time he came, He made it clear what he expected in return. Eli went very still. I told him no. Maggie said, her voice perfectly steady. I told him no, and I told him if he came back, I would go to his wife and his supervisor and every person in Billings who would listen. She met Eli's eyes. He didn't come back. But his name is Arthur Slade, and he works for Consolidated Mining. And if Vane has a contact in Billings who gave him the idea for the Cooper debt scheme, I would bet everything I have that it's Arthur Slade. She paused. I should have told Ruth. She stopped. I was ashamed, which is wrong of me. I didn't do anything wrong. You didn't do anything wrong, Eli said immediately. I know that. Her jaw tightened. I know it here. She touched her chest. Getting it to feel true is a different project. She stood up, picked up Rose, who had been fussing at the edge of crying for the last several minutes. If Slade connected Vane to the debt, there might be correspondence. Letters. Vane keeps records. Men like him always keep records, because they don't trust anyone enough to rely on memory. She bounced Rose against her shoulder. If we could get into his office before the hearing. No, Eli said. I'm not suggesting you break in. I know what you're suggesting. You walk into that bank, pretend you want to negotiate, get close enough to see something he doesn't mean to show you. He looked at her hard. You walk into Vane's bank alone with those babies, Maggie. He doesn't need a judge. He takes them right there and has Tanner file the paperwork after. I wouldn't bring the babies. Then you're separated from them, which is exactly what he wants. She looked at him over Rose's head. Then what do we do? Walk into that hearing with a 3-page statement and a dead man's debt transfer and hope a judge with a financial obligation to Aldous Vane decides to do the right thing. We walk in with everything we've got and we fight. That's not enough. Maybe not. His voice was rough. But it's what's real. And I'd rather fight with what's real than risk you in that building alone. She turned away, not in anger, in thought. He'd learned the difference. She bounced Rose in thought, and he watched her and waited. There's something else, she said finally to the window. Ruth said Vane's argument is going to be impropriety. Me living here with you. She turned back. She's right. It's his sharpest knife, and he's going to use it. An unmarried woman living in a single man's home, he's going to make it sound like the worst possible environment for 2 infants, and there are going to be people in that room who believe him without needing any more evidence than that. Eli looked at her steadily. I know. Do you have an answer for it? I've been thinking about an answer for it since Ruth left last night. Maggie waited. He crossed the room, not fast, not slow. He stopped 2 feet from her, close enough that Rose reached out and grabbed his collar with one small fist, the way she always did when he came near. He unhooked her fingers gently and held her hand for a moment before letting go. This isn't how I would have chosen to ask, he said. If circumstances were different, if we had time. He met her eyes. But we don't have time, and I'm not going to pretend we do. He paused. Maggie, marry me, before the hearing. Tonight, if the preacher will come. She stared at him. It solves the impropriety argument. It gives you my name, my property, my standing in this territory. Whitfield can't use your living situation against you if your living situation is legal and documented. He held her gaze. And beyond all of that, beyond every practical reason, I'm asking because I want to. Because somewhere in the last 6 days, I stopped thinking about you as a woman I helped and started thinking about you as... He stopped. I don't have the right word. Mine, Rose announced, still gripping the air where his collar had been. Despite everything, Maggie made a sound that was almost a laugh. Her eyes were full. Eli. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You don't have to do this. You don't have to sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice. He said it quietly, but with a certainty that left no room for argument. I've been alone in this cabin for 6 years. I know what that feels like, and I know what the last 6 days have felt like, and they are not the same thing. He paused. I'm not asking out of pity or strategy. I'm asking because I mean it. But I need you to tell me the truth. If you're saying yes because of the hearing, say so, and I'll still do it. I'd rather you be honest than grateful. Maggie looked at him for a long time. Rose was gnawing on her own fist, now indifferent to the moment. James slept on in the drawer, also indifferent. "I'm saying yes because of the hearing," Maggie said slowly. "And because you built a fire before you thought about yourself when you got us inside. And because you turned your back without being asked. And because you said Sarah's name out loud for the first time in a year, and you said it to me." She swallowed. "I'm saying yes for all of it. Is that honest enough?" "That's honest enough." Isaiah Cole found the preacher. Ruth Pryor stood witness. Harold Beckett stood on the other side and held James, who woke up at the wrong moment, and expressed his opinion of the proceedings loudly until Harold bounced him into silence, with the desperation of a man who had forgotten how small babies were. It was not a romantic ceremony. It was 7 minutes in Eli's kitchen with 2 witnesses and a baby complaining, and another baby watching the lantern light with solemn fascination. The preacher said the words, and they said theirs. And when it was done, Ruth shook Maggie's hand and then pulled her into a brief, fierce hug that startled both of them, and Isaiah shook Eli's hand and held it for an extra moment without saying anything, which said everything. After they left, Maggie stood at the window with both babies settled finally and the cabin quiet. Eli was at the table, going over Ruth's statement one more time. "Elias Greer," she said. I don't actually know your middle name." He looked up. "James?" She looked down at the baby in her left arm. "Of course it is," she said softly. He looked back at the statement, but he was smiling and she saw it. They were up before dawn. Ruth arrived at 7 with food and a clean dress she'd pressed the night before, and Maggie put it on without vanity and without protest, because she understood the practical importance of not looking like a woman who'd been walking through January in split boots. Ruth pinned her hair with a quiet efficiency that reminded Maggie of her own mother, a thought that opened something painful and deep that she closed firmly. Not today. Today she needed everything she had on the surface. Isaiah met them on the road into Harlan's Crossing, riding his old mare straight-backed in the way of a man who had decided this was worth sitting straight for. Harold Beckett fell in alongside them at the edge of town, turning his hat in his hands already. His wife had come with him, a small, determined woman named Clara, who had apparently decided that if Harold was going to do the right thing, he was going to do it with a witness. Vane's Bank sat at the center of Main Street, brick-faced and solid in the way of buildings owned by men who wanted you to feel their permanence when you walked toward them. 2 of Vane's men stood outside the door. Not deputies, not official. Just men who stood where Vane told them to stand. Eli walked past them without slowing. Maggie walked beside him. She was carrying both babies. She had made this decision herself that morning, before anyone could suggest otherwise. When Ruth had offered to hold them during the hearing, Maggie had shaken her head. "He wants to separate me from them," she'd said. "Every minute they're in my arms is a minute he can't pretend they're already somewhere else." Vane's office was exactly as she had imagined it. Large, heavy, designed to communicate authority to everyone who entered it. Whitfield sat to one side of the desk, a narrow man in his 60s with careful eyes that assessed everything and revealed nothing. Vane himself stood near the window, and Aldous Vane in person was not what she'd expected either. He was calm, almost pleasant-looking. The kind of man who was invited to dinners because he knew how to behave at dinners, and what happened to people who crossed him happened somewhere else at a distance through mechanisms that kept his hands clean. He looked at Maggie when she walked in, and his eyes went immediately to the babies and stayed there. And something in that look, something possessive and calculating, that had nothing to do with their welfare, settled every nerve in her body into cold certainty. She knew exactly what she was fighting and why, and that knowledge was worth more than she could have put into words. "Mrs. Hale," Vane said. "Mrs. Greer," Eli said beside her. The room shifted. Whitfield's careful eyes moved between them. Vane's expression didn't change, but something tightened around his mouth. He hadn't known. Sallow hadn't told him. Last night had happened in enough privacy that it hadn't reached Vane's ears yet, and the fact that it surprised him that anything had happened outside his awareness and control was visible in that small tightening for just a moment before he smoothed it away. "I see," Vane said. "The debt transfer lists a Margaret Hale," Eli said before Vane could recover his footing. "There is no Margaret Hale. There is a Margaret Greer who is my wife and who holds legal status on my property. I'd like Judge Whitfield to note that any documents pertaining to a Margaret Hale are therefore being applied to the wrong person." Whitfield made a note. His face gave nothing away. "A marriage of convenience arranged the night before a legal hearing," Vane said pleasantly, "is unlikely to impress anyone. A fraudulent debt transfer filed under a dead man's name at the county seat," Isaiah Cole said from the back of the room, "is a federal crime." He said it the same way he said everything, evenly, without drama, with the authority of a man who had been telling the truth in this county for 50 years and was not accustomed to being disbelieved. "I'd like Judge Whitfield to note that as well." Whitfield made another note. He looked at Vane, then at Isaiah, then at Maggie, who was standing in the middle of the room holding her children and meeting his gaze without flinching. "Mrs. Greer," Whitfield said, "in your own words." And Maggie spoke. She spoke for 20 minutes without stopping. She started with Thomas. She described the mine, the collapse, the company man who came to the door with $7 and a form to sign. She described the week after managing 2 newborns in company housing, while every person around her waited for her to vacate so someone else could move in. She described the 7 towns between Billings and Harlan's Crossing, each one in enough detail that the room understood she was not recounting a vague hardship, but a specific documented journey with specific days and specific rejections. She named the boarding house in Harlow Creek and the owner who'd used the word encumbrance. She named the town of Grady, where a woman had given her bread and another woman had told her to move along before she brought trouble to the street. She named the road where Eli had found her, and she described plainly and without requesting sympathy what it had felt like to fall and to twist her body so the babies felt nothing. Whitfield wrote the whole time she talked. Vane's lawyer, a thin man who had been introduced as Fletcher Moss, made 2 attempts to interrupt with procedural objections. Both times Whitfield raised one hand without looking up from his notes, and Moss stopped talking. When Maggie finished, the room was quiet. Vane broke it first, because Vane was not a man who was comfortable with silence that he hadn't arranged. "Your Honor, the personal circumstances of Mrs. Greer, while regrettable, do not address the outstanding debt or the question of whether these children have been placed in a stable. The debt," Whitfield said, still looking at his notes. "Tell me about the debt, specifically the county filing. Who witnessed the transfer?" Moss stepped forward, produced a document. "A notary in Billings, man named Cruz. Cruz died in November," Isaiah said from the back. "Typhoid. Before the transfer date on that document." The room shifted. Whitfield looked up for the first time in several minutes. He looked at the document in Moss's hand. Then he looked at Moss. "When is this document dated?" Moss looked at the paper. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not quite, but the particular expression of a man who has just realized the ground beneath him is not as solid as advertised. "December the 3rd, he said. "And you say the notary died in November." Whitfield looked at Isaiah. "November the 14th. I can produce the death record. My granddaughter lives in Billings. I wrote to her 3 days ago when this business started. She sent back what I asked for by return rider." Isaiah reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He walked it to Whitfield without drama, as if delivering a document was the most ordinary thing in the world. The notary who allegedly witnessed this transfer was in the ground 3 weeks before the transfer date, which means either the document is backdated or the signature is forged. Either way, it's fraudulent, and a fraudulent county filing is a federal matter. Vane's calm did not break. It bent slightly in the way of something under more pressure than it was built for, but it did not break. "There may be a clerical error in the dating," he said smoothly. "These things happen. It doesn't invalidate the underlying debt." "The underlying debt," Eli said, "was created by a man named Arthur Slade, who works for Consolidated Mining in Billings and who visited my wife 3 times after her husband's death to offer help in exchange for things she declined to provide." His voice was level. "When she refused, he found another way to make her life difficult." I'd be interested to know when Mr. Slade first made contact with your office, Mr. Vane, and what was exchanged between them. Vane looked at Eli for the first time since the hearing started. Really looked at him. That is an extraordinary accusation. It's a question. You're welcome to answer it. I'm not required to answer unsupported allegations from a man whose wife you're trying to strip of her children using a dead man's signature. Eli didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You're right. You're not required to answer anything. Neither is Judge Whitfield required to proceed with a hearing built on documents that may constitute federal fraud. He looked at Whitfield. I'd like to formally request a delay pending investigation of the filing. We can have documentation from Billings within a week. If the debt is legitimate, it'll survive a week's scrutiny. If it isn't, this hearing shouldn't proceed at all. Whitfield set his pen down. He looked at his notes. He looked at Vane. He looked at Maggie, who was standing in the middle of the room with James asleep against her left shoulder, and Rose watching the proceedings with her usual thoughtful attention, and who was looking back at the judge with the steady, unflinching gaze of a woman who had already made peace with every bad outcome and was no longer afraid of any of them. I'm granting the delay, Whitfield said. 2 weeks. I want documentation from the county seat in Billings regarding the notary's death and the filing date. I want a statement from the Consolidated Mining Company regarding any communications between their employee Arthur Slade and parties in this territory. He capped his pen. In the interim, the children remain with their mother. Any attempt to remove them from her custody prior to the reconvened hearing will be treated as contempt. He stood. Mr. Vane, Mr. Moss. Good day. He walked out. Moss followed with the expression of a man reviewing his own life choices. Vane stayed where he was. The room emptied slowly. Ruth took Maggie's arm and steered her toward the door. Harold and his wife went ahead. Isaiah paused at the threshold and looked back at Vane long and deliberate, and then walked out without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. Eli was last. He stopped in the doorway. Vane was still at the window. Still calm, or wearing calm the way a man wears a coat in weather he didn't plan for. He looked at Eli and he said quietly, You think you've bought time? I've bought 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Vane nodded slowly. And in 2 weeks, you think the world changes. I think the documentation from Billings changes what Whitfield can legally do. Eli held his gaze. I think a federal fraud inquiry changes what you can afford to have people looking at. And I think you're smart enough to know that the story of a widow with 2 newborns being pursued by a man who wants her babies for his brother's house is not a story that plays well when it reaches the territorial newspapers. He paused. Isaiah Cole has a friend at the Helena Courier. Good friend, they say. Known each other 40 years. Something moved through Vane's eyes, fast contained. Is that a threat, Greer? It's information, same as what you gave Sallow to deliver to me. Eli set his hat on. Good day, Mr. Vane. He walked out into the cold and found Maggie standing on the boards outside Ruth, beside her both babies still held against her chest. She looked at his face when he came through the door, and whatever she saw in it made some of the tension leave her shoulders. Not all of it, not yet, but some. 2 weeks. He said. I heard. She exhaled. It's not over. No. But we're still standing. Yes. Ruth squeezed her arm once brisk and decided. Come to the boarding house, both of you. I've got a room with a proper crib that a family left behind last spring, and I've got soup on the stove, and I will not take no for an answer from either of you today. They went. The boarding house was warm in the way of buildings that had been consistently inhabited and cared for the warmth of regular fires and regular cooking and regular human presence. Ruth set them up in a back room with the promised crib, large enough for both babies, just if they were positioned carefully, and a bed and a chair, and enough privacy that Maggie sat down on the edge of the bed and let everything she'd been holding upright for the past 4 hours come undone for approximately 90 seconds before she pulled it back together. Eli sat in the chair. He didn't pretend he hadn't seen it. 90 seconds, he said. That's about right. She pressed her fingertips against her eyes. Thomas used to say I didn't cry enough, that I stored things up. She dropped her hands. He wasn't wrong. You cried at the right time, though. That's harder to manage. She looked at him. What do you store up? He thought about that, honestly. Work. I work until I'm too tired to think. Been doing it 6 years. He looked at his hands. Hasn't been working as well lately. Since when? Since about January the 14th. She was quiet. Outside the door, they could hear Ruth moving around the kitchen, the sound of a ladle against a pot, the small domestic music of someone feeding people as an act of care. James made a sound in the crib, settling deeper into sleep, not waking. Rose was already asleep, both fists curled. I meant what I said this morning, Maggie said. Not looking at him, looking at the crib. When I said yes, I want you to know that. I wasn't performing it for the room. I know. You can't know. You just have to take my word. That's what knowing means between people. He looked at her. You take the word because you've watched how someone operates long enough to trust it. I've watched you operate for a week. He paused. That's enough for me. She looked at him then. Her eyes were tired and clear and full of something that had been a long time building. It's fast, she said. Yes. Thomas and I courted for 8 months. I know. And yet. He held her gaze. I'm not Thomas. This isn't the same thing. It doesn't have to be the same thing to be real. She nodded slowly. No, it doesn't. She looked back at the crib. They need a father. I've been trying not to think about that because I didn't want to need something from you that you hadn't offered. But they do. They need someone to show James how to be a man. To show Rose what a man who respects women looks like. Her voice was careful, deliberate. Those things matter. They matter more than I can say. I know they do. Can you do that? She looked at him, not pleading, asking, directly the way she asked everything. Not because you married me this morning in a 7-minute ceremony, but because you want to. Can you be that for them? Eli was quiet for a moment. He looked at the crib, at James's fist, and Rose's perfect closed face. He thought about what it cost to say yes to that question, honestly, what it required a man to open up that he'd had sealed for a long time. I can, he said. I've been practicing for a week already. Didn't realize that's what I was doing until just now. Something in her face went soft and full at the same time. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Ruth's soup was bean and salt pork, and it was the best thing Maggie had eaten in 3 months, which she told Ruth plainly, and Ruth said she'd been told that before, and it never got old. Isaiah arrived mid-afternoon with Harold in tow, and they sat around Ruth's kitchen table and planned. Isaiah had already written to his contact at the Helena Courier. The letter had gone out that morning with a writer he trusted. Parker's been after Vane for 2 years, Isaiah said, but he's never had anything concrete enough to print. A fraudulent county filing a connection to Consolidated Mining, an attempt to seize 2 infants from a widow that's concrete. He looked around the table. The story runs before the 2 weeks are up. Vane's under public scrutiny, and public scrutiny is the one thing he can't buy his way out of. He'll know it was you, Harold said. Yes, he will. Isaiah seemed completely unbothered by this. I'm 70 years old, Harold. What's he going to take from me? He could try. Isaiah's voice was mild. He's tried before. I'm still here. He keeps losing patience with me. Something crossed his weathered face that might have been satisfaction. I find that encouraging. Tanner came by Ruth's boarding house at 4 in the afternoon. He came to the back door, which was a choice, and he knocked quietly, which was another choice. Ruth opened the door and looked at him for a moment before stepping aside. He came into the kitchen, hat in hand, and looked at Eli. Vane's been in his office since the hearing, he said. Sent Moss out twice. Moss came back both times looking like he'd eaten something bad. He turned his hat slowly in his hands. I don't know what you've got on him, Greer, but whatever it is, it landed. The filing was fraudulent, Eli said. The notary was dead before the transfer date. Tanner's eyes closed briefly. When he opened them again, he looked tired in a deep and specific way. I didn't know that. I know you didn't. I want you to know that He stopped, started again. I've been making compromises for a long time. I told myself they were small ones, that the town ran better with Vane having what he needed than with him being obstructed. He looked at Maggie, then quickly away. I didn't think he'd go after children. What did you think he'd go after? Maggie asked. Her voice was not unkind, but it was precise. After the farms, after the water rights, after 3 years of watching what he does. What did you think the bottom of it looked like? Tanner had no answer for that. If you want to do something useful, Eli said, you could formally document that Sallow delivered a threat to my property last week. Date, time, content of the message, signed and witnessed. That's a statement against Vane. Yes. Tanner looked at his hat for a long time. Then he set it on Ruth's kitchen table and said, You got paper. The next 10 days were the strangest Eli had ever lived. Strange because they were ordinary. Strange because ordinariness after everything felt like something he'd forgotten the texture of. He and Maggie rode back to the cabin the next morning. She insisted on it. The cabin was their home, she said, and she wasn't going to be driven out of their home by a man who hadn't won anything yet. Eli drove the wagon, and she rode beside him with both babies in the box behind tucked in blankets, complaining about the cold in their individual ways. James loudly and Rose through increasingly pointed silence. Life organized itself around the babies, which was the only organizing principle that made sense. James ate and slept and announced his existence with a thoroughness that suggested he would grow up to be a man who took up space without apology. Rose observed everything, filed it, and occasionally offered her assessment in the form of a long, unblinking look that made grown adults feel they were being evaluated. Eli was not immune to this. He found himself one evening explaining the mechanism of the front door latch to her in complete seriousness, because she was watching him fix it with such focused attention that it seemed rude not to. Maggie caught him at it and didn't laugh, which he appreciated. She just said, "She does that to me too," and went back to the stove. They fell into rhythms. She cooked because she was better at it, and because it gave her something to do with her hands, while both babies slept, which they occasionally did. Simultaneously, a gift that felt almost suspicious. He did the outdoor work and came inside at meals and in the evenings, and the evenings were the part of the day he found himself thinking about during the outdoor work. They talked. About Thomas, she spoke about him freely, not with grief that needed managing, but with the matter-of-fact honesty of someone integrating a loss rather than hiding from it. About Sarah, Eli found to his own surprise that speaking about her got easier with practice, that putting her into sentences didn't drain something from him the way he'd expected, but did something closer to the opposite. About what they wanted the land to be. About what they wanted James and Rose to know about the world they were growing up into. On the 8th day, a letter came from Helena. It was addressed to Eli, but Maggie was standing next to him when he opened it, James on her hip, and Rose in the crook of his arm, because she'd taken to falling asleep against his chest in the evenings, and he'd stopped pretending he minded. The letter was from the Territorial Marshal's office. The fraudulent filing had been confirmed. Arthur Slade had been interviewed in Billings, and had apparently and somewhat remarkably told the truth. Not out of conscience, the letter implied, but because Consolidated Mining had thrown him to the wolves the moment the inquiry arrived, and a man alone and frightened will often choose the version of the truth that makes him look least responsible. His statement named Vane directly, named Moss, named 3 county officials who had assisted with the filing in exchange for debt forgiveness. Maggie read it twice. Then she sat down at the table, which was the first time in 10 days Eli had seen her sit down in the middle of the day. "It's enough," she said. "This is enough to go federal." "Yes." "Whitfield can't proceed with the hearing now. The underlying documents are criminal evidence." She looked up. "He's done. Vane is done." "Not immediately. These things take time. His lawyers will fight. He'll try to minimize. But he's done." Her voice was certain. "Not today, maybe, Not in a week. But the thing he was using, the legal machinery, the paperwork, the judge, he had in his pocket, all of it is gone. And without the law, he's just a man who made enemies. She looked at the letter. Men like that don't survive without the law on their side. It's the only thing that makes them different from bullies. Eli looked at her. You sound like Isaiah. Isaiah is a very smart man. She set the letter on the table. Her hand was steady. He watched her absorb it, not with triumph, not with relief exactly, but with the deep exhale of someone who has been fighting upstream for long enough that stopping feels almost unfamiliar. James is going to need a nap soon, she said. He's been fighting it for an hour. I know, he's been giving me looks. She smiled at that. It was the kind of smile that had been arriving more easily in the last several days, genuine and unguarded, in a way that her early smiles hadn't been, because her early smiles had always been checked against what was coming. This one wasn't checked against anything. Ruth arrived that afternoon, as if she'd somehow known. She came in, read the letter, folded it back precisely, and handed it to Eli. I'll write to Parker tonight. He'll want to update the story. She looked at Maggie. You should know there's been talk in town, since the hearing, since Tanner filed his statement. She paused. People have been talking about Vane differently. The way they talked about him before they got scared of him. Like he's a person instead of a force of nature. She looked at her hands briefly. That's because of you. Both of you, but mainly you. She looked at Maggie. You stood in that room with 2 babies, and you spoke the truth plainly, and people saw it. That matters. It has weight that the letter doesn't have. Maggie was quiet for a moment. I didn't do it for weight, she said. I did it because there was no other option. I know, Ruth said. That's why it had weight. After Ruth left the cabin, settled into the particular quiet of a late winter afternoon, fire-going babies finally both asleep, the day's work finished or suspended. Eli sat at the table. Maggie sat across from him. The letter was between them. What happens now? She asked. The marshal's office takes it from here. Whitfield cancels the hearing. The federal inquiry opens. It takes months probably. Vane's lawyers fight every step. He looked at her. But you're not a target anymore. The debt is exposed as fraud. The custody case is built on fraudulent documents. There's nothing left for them to use. And Slade. Slade's the one who talked. He'll cut a deal, testify, get something reduced. The men at the county seat will do the same. He paused. Vane himself might never see the inside of a cell. Men like him usually don't. But everything he built here, the control, the machinery, the ability to make the law do what he wanted, that's gone. Maggie nodded. She looked at the table, at her own hands, at the ring she'd been wearing for 9 days on a finger it fit without any adjustment, which she'd noticed the first morning and hadn't mentioned to anyone. I've been thinking about California, she said. He went still. Not the way you think, she said quickly, looking up. My cousin Margaret, the one who turned me away. I wrote to her last week, before the hearing. I didn't tell you because I didn't know what I was writing exactly. Whether it was a goodbye letter or an accounting or... She stopped. She wrote back yesterday. I got the letter when you were in the barn. What did she say? She said she was wrong. That she was in a dark place when I wrote to her in November, and that she made a decision out of fear that she's been regretting since she heard what happened to us. Maggie's jaw worked. She wants to come visit. Come spring if we'd have her. Eli looked at her steadily. Would you want that? I think... She paused. I think James and Rose should know their mother's family. I think I've been alone long enough that I understand what it costs to refuse connection out of fear, and I don't want to do it to myself or to them. She met his eyes. I also think that I live here now, that this is my home, and that Margaret coming to visit doesn't change that. No, Eli said. It doesn't. But I wanted you to know. Before I wrote back and said yes, I wanted you to have a say. He looked at her for a moment. At this woman who had walked 19 miles through a January blizzard to keep 2 small lives from going out, who had stood in front of a corrupt judge and spoken the plain truth without flinching, who had said yes to him in a 7-minute kitchen ceremony, not because she had to, but because she meant it, and who was now asking his opinion about a letter before she replied to it because she understood already what partnership actually required. "Write back and say yes," he said. She nodded, picked up the pen he kept on the table. "Eli. Thank you for finding us on that road." He looked at her. "You did the hardest part. You stayed on the road long enough to be found." From the crib came Rose's voice, not crying, just the quiet inquiring sound she made when she woke up and found the world still there and wanted to confirm it. Maggie set the pen down and went to her, lifted her, held her up so their faces were level. Rose looked at her mother with those watchful dark eyes, and then reached out and touched Maggie's cheek with one small hand, careful and deliberate the way she did everything. "I know," Maggie told her quietly. "I know." Spring came to Montana the way it always did. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm day followed by 3 cold ones. Mud that froze overnight and thawed by noon. The creek that ran along the north edge of Eli's property, which had been locked under ice since November, broke open on a Tuesday morning with a sound like a rifle shot that brought both of them to the window before either was fully awake. Maggie stood beside him, watching the water move, and said, "That's the best sound I've heard in months." Better than the marshal's letter. She considered it seriously the way she considered everything. "Equal to," she said, "but more immediate." James from the crib announced that he too had opinions about the noise and wished to be consulted. Rose beside him slept through it entirely, which was characteristic of both of them. The federal inquiry had been open for 6 weeks by then. Vane's lawyers had done exactly what Eli predicted, fought every step. Filed motions, requested delays, questioned the validity of Slade's testimony on the grounds that a man who confessed to participating in fraud was an unreliable narrator of his own participation in fraud, which was an argument that Fletcher Moss delivered with apparent sincerity and which the federal examiner rejected with apparent impatience. The county officials who had assisted with the fraudulent filing had testified in exchange for reduced charges. Tanner's formal statement had been entered into the record. The debt document had been voided. Judge Whitfield had canceled the custody hearing 12 days after granting the delay. His letter to the parties was 3 sentences long and contained no apology, which Eli respected. Whitfield was not a good man exactly, but he was a precise one, and precise men, when shown that the ground beneath them is unstable, will step off it. Vane himself had not left Harlan's Crossing. This surprised people. Eli was not surprised. Aldous Vane had spent 30 years building something in this territory, and he was not the kind of man who abandoned it because the legal architecture had shifted. He was the kind of man who waited, reassessed, and found another angle. Eli had explained this to Maggie in February, and she had said, "Then we stay watchful," and gone back to feeding Rose, which was the correct response. What none of them had anticipated was Vane's brother. Isaiah brought the news on a Wednesday afternoon in late March, riding his old mare with the deliberate pace of a man carrying information he hasn't fully sorted yet. He came inside, sat at the kitchen table, accepted coffee from Maggie, and said, "Isaiah Vane's wife left him." They both looked at him. "Last week," Isaiah continued, "took her sister's wagon and went back to her family in Ohio. No letter, no explanation to anyone in town. She was just gone." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "Word is, she'd been trying to have children for 12 years. Word is, she finally understood this winter what her husband and Aldous had actually been planning to do to get them, what kind of people they were willing to hurt." He paused. "Word is, she was not willing to be that kind of person." Maggie sat down slowly. She had Rose in her arms. Rose, who was now alert and opinionated in the way of an infant who is 3 months old and has decided the world is mostly interesting, and she looked at Isaiah and said, "She didn't know. Apparently not." Isaiah's voice was careful. "Her name is Constance. Was a school teacher before she married Isaiah Vane. By all accounts, a decent woman who made a poor choice of husband at 22 and has been living with the consequences." He looked at his coffee. She left a letter for the marshal's office, a written statement about conversations she'd overheard between the brothers, about the plan for the children, about other things. He looked up. It's significant testimony. The federal examiner received it yesterday. Eli set his cup down. How significant? Significant enough that Vane's lawyers stopped filing motions this morning. Isaiah paused. Moss was seen leaving town with 2 bags and a horse that didn't belong to him. He may have decided that the retainer Vane is still paying him is insufficient for what the retainer now requires. Maggie looked at Eli. He looked at her over Rose's head. Something passed between them that didn't need words, not triumph. Nothing as clean as that. But the particular feeling of a weight you've been carrying for so long, you forgot it was separate from you beginning to lift. What happens to Vane? Maggie asked. The examiner thinks criminal charges within the month. Fraud, conspiracy, the county filing. Possibly more depending on what else Constance's statement opens. Isaiah finished his coffee. He won't run. That's the strange thing. He's still in his office, still going to the bank, acting like a man who believes that if he maintains the performance long enough, the audience will forget what they saw. He set his cup down. He won't be right about that, but it's interesting to watch. After Isaiah left, Maggie stood at the window for a while. James had woken up and was in Eli's arms, conducting his usual thorough investigation of Eli's face with both hands, which Eli submitted to with patience, because James found it satisfying and satisfaction in an infant he had learned was worth the cost. Constance Vane, Maggie said to the window. You feel sorry for her. I feel something for her. She turned. She made a poor choice at 22. Most people do. She didn't know what she was in the middle of, and when she found out, she left, and she told the truth. She looked at James, at Rose in the crook of Eli's arm, at the 2 small people who were the axis around which everything in the last 3 months had turned. It took courage to name it and walk away from it. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not. She crossed to him and took Rose, and for a moment they stood together in the kitchen, each holding one baby. And the domesticity of it was so complete and so ordinary that Eli felt it like a physical sensation, the way you feel warmth after cold, not when you first come inside, but a few minutes later when your body finally believes the cold is gone. Margaret, the cousin, arrived on a Friday in April, and she came by wagon from Bozeman, where she'd ridden the train from Sacramento, and she arrived in the late afternoon when the light was doing what spring light did in Montana, long and golden and apologetic, as if making up for winter. She was a small woman, a few years older than Maggie, with the same dark hair and the same directness in the eyes, and she stood in the yard, holding her traveling bag and looking at the cabin and then at Maggie, and she said, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, and I know that's not enough, and I'm going to say it anyway. Maggie looked at her for a moment. A long moment. Eli, standing on the porch, stayed where he was. Then Maggie said, Come inside. James is about to wake up from his nap, and you should be there when he does because he likes an audience. Margaret laughed a surprised sound and followed her inside. The 2 weeks of Margaret's visit rearranged the cabin in ways Eli hadn't anticipated and found he didn't mind. She was a practical woman, good with her hands, and she understood without being told that she was not a guest in the traditional sense, but a person making good on a debt, and the currency she was paying in was usefulness. She cooked. She held babies for hours at a stretch so Maggie could sleep. She and Eli developed an efficient working relationship built on the shared understanding that Maggie was the thing they both cared most about, and that caring for her required different things from each of them. On her 3rd day sitting at the kitchen table, while Rose studied her with that particular Rose intensity, Margaret said, She's going to be something, this one. She already is, Eli said. She looks at you like she's already decided something. She decided something the first night. He looked at Rose. I think she decided I was trustworthy. I've been trying to deserve it since. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Maggie told me how you found them. She was on the road. She told me you said she did the hardest part, staying on the road long enough to be found. She looked at him directly. I want you to know I understand what I failed her, that I know what the cost of my failure was, and that I am grateful every day that you were on that road and not someone else. Eli met her eyes. "I was going to check the north fence," he said. "I almost went south instead." He looked at Rose. "I still think about that sometimes, how close it was." "Don't," Margaret said simply. "You went north. That's what happened." The day before Margaret left, something occurred that Eli would think about for the rest of his life. It was evening. Margaret was at the table writing letters. Eli was outside. Maggie was in the kitchen, and both babies were in the main room, in their shared crib, which they had outgrown in width, but not in preference. They still slept, pressed together, the way they had since before they were born. James's forehead against Rose's cheek. Rose's fist closed around James's sleeve. Maggie came to the door and said, "Eli, come look at this." He came inside. She pointed at the crib. James was awake. Rose was awake. They were looking at each other with the focused attention they occasionally turned on each other, as if conducting a conversation in a language they'd developed independently and had not yet decided to share with anyone else. James made a sound. Rose made a different sound. James reached out and put his hand on Rose's face very gently, with a care that was startling in a person who had been alive for 14 weeks. Rose allowed this. She looked at her brother's hand on her cheek, and then she looked at Maggie, and then at Eli, and then back at James, and she made a sound that was different from any sound Eli had heard her make before. Lower, more settled, like confirmation. "They know," Maggie said softly, "that they belong to each other." Eli looked at them. At these two small people who had come into the world in the worst possible circumstances, and had somehow, through the stubborn insistence of their mother and the chance direction of a man on a fence-checking errand, arrived at this room, this crib, this evening. "Yeah," he said. "They know." Maggie slipped her hand into his. He held it. Margaret left on a Tuesday with promises and a standing invitation and the address of the cabin written in 2 places in case she lost one. She hugged Maggie for a long time at the wagon. She shook Eli's hand, and then, apparently deciding this was insufficient, hugged him too, which surprised him, and which he returned after a brief delay. "Write to me," she said to Maggie. "I will. And send me drawings of them when they're bigger. I want to watch them grow up even from a distance." "You don't have to watch from a distance," Maggie said. "California isn't forever if you don't want it to be." Margaret looked at her. Something moved across her face. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose it isn't." She drove away. They stood in the yard and watched until the wagon was out of sight, and then Maggie said, "Good," in a tone that contained an entire emotional reckoning compressed into a single syllable, and went inside to nurse the babies. The letter from the Federal Examiner arrived in May. Aldous Vane had been formally charged. Fraud conspiracy, criminal filing of false documents, bribery of public officials across 4 counties. The territorial governor had issued a public statement. Parker's story had run in the Helena Courier 3 weeks prior and had been picked up by 2 papers in the East, one of which had sent its own correspondent to Harlan's Crossing. A young man named Collins, who asked careful questions and wrote them down in a notebook that reminded Eli of Ruth's worn one. Collins had asked to interview Maggie. She had agreed on the condition that the story focus on the fraudulent filing and the custody attempt, and not on the details of her journey from Billings, which she considered private. Collins had agreed. The story he wrote described a widow and her newborn twins, a fraudulent debt, and a community that had stood together to expose a man who had been running a territory like a private kingdom for 30 years. It described the courage of a woman who had walked through a January blizzard with 2 infants and then walked into a corrupt judge's hearing and told the plain truth. It did not use the word hero. Maggie had asked him not to. "Why?" Collins had asked, genuinely curious. "Because I wasn't being heroic," she said. "I was being a mother. Those are different things, and mixing them up does a disservice to both." Collins had written that down too. Isaiah read the published story at Ruth's kitchen table on a Thursday morning and said it was accurate, which was his highest form of praise. Ruth said it was well written, which was hers. Harold Beckett read it twice and then folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket and said he was going to send it to his wife's mother in Ohio, who had always thought small towns were nothing but trouble, and that he thought this might update her view. Tanner had resigned his position in April. He'd told Eli the day he handed in his badge that he was going back to Colorado, where he'd come from originally. "Too much history here," he said, "and not the good kind." He'd paused at the door. "For what it's worth. I knew what Vane was. I told myself I was managing him, keeping the damage contained." His jaw tightened. "I was wrong about that." "Roy!" Eli looked at him. "Go to Colorado." Tanner went. On a warm evening in late May, Eli and Maggie sat on the porch after the babies were down. This was their time, the hour after the children slept, when the cabin was quiet, and the day's work was finished, and there was nothing required of either of them except to be where they were. They had been married 4 months, which felt both very short and entirely sufficient. "I've been thinking about Sarah," Maggie said. He looked at her. She was watching the last of the light over the western ridge, her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "About what specifically?" "About whether she'd have been all right with this." She paused. "With me. In her home. With her husband." Eli was quiet for a moment. "She'd have wanted me to be happy," he said. "That's not a guess. That's who she was. It's easy to say the dead would want what benefits the living. It's also sometimes true." He looked out at the ridge. "She was practical. She would have looked at what we have here, the children, the land, the life, and she would have thought it was good. She would have thought you were good." He paused. "She would have approved of your directness. She had no patience for people who wouldn't say what they meant." Maggie almost smiled. "I come by it honestly. Thomas used to say I had no diplomatic instincts whatsoever." Thomas was perceptive. She did smile at that fully. Then she looked at her cup and said, "I don't think about losing you. I should probably. I think a person in my position should be more aware of how quickly things can change, how much can be taken in a single day. But I don't think about it." She met his eyes. "I don't think about it because I've decided not to spend the life I have fearing the life I might lose. I had enough of that in January." He looked at her. This woman who had walked 19 miles in split boots to keep 2 lives from going out, who had stood in a corrupt judge's office and told the plain truth without flinching, who had said yes to him in a 7-minute kitchen ceremony and meant it, and had been proving she meant it every day since, not with declarations, but with presence. With her hands on the table and her voice steady and her eyes finding his across a room full of difficulty and saying without words that she was still there. "I've decided the same thing," he said. She reached over and took his hand. He held it. From inside the cabin a sound. James waking with his customary announcement. Then Rose's voice answering him, the quiet sound she made that always seemed to say, "I know I'm here, we're still here," which was everything any of them needed confirmed. Maggie stood. She squeezed his hand before she let go. She went inside. He stayed on the porch for another minute, listening to her voice through the door, as she went to them low and steady, the voice she used with the babies that was different from every other voice she had, softer and more certain. At the same time, the voice of a woman who had carried 2 lives through the worst January in recent memory, and would go on carrying them and him and this life they had built from a chance meeting on a frozen road. He thought about that road sometimes, about the shape in the snow that wasn't an animal, about the 90 seconds between seeing it and knowing what it was, about what would have happened, what would not have happened if he'd gone south to check the fence instead. He didn't linger there long. Margaret had been right. He'd gone north. That was what happened. He stood when inside and closed the door on the May evening on the sound of the creek running free on the last of the light over the western ridge. Inside, Maggie had both babies settled one against each shoulder. She looked at him over their heads with that look she had, the unguarded one that had been arriving more easily since February, and she said, "They want you." He crossed the room. He put one hand on James's back and one on Rose's and felt them breathing steady and real, the twin heartbeats of two small people who had survived everything their beginning had thrown at them and were growing daily into the people they were going to be. "We're all right," he said. Not to the babies, to Maggie, to the room, to whatever it was that needed to hear it. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Yes," she said. "We are." And they were. Margaret Hale had walked out of the worst January of her life with nothing but 2 newborns and a death certificate and the stubborn refusal to stop moving. She had found a man who knelt in the snow without being asked. She had stood in the rooms where power lived and told the truth until the power had nothing left to stand on. She had built a family from wreckage and a home from a stranger's cabin and a life from the raw material of survival. She had walked out of the cold and into something permanent. That was not luck. That was not rescue. That was the result of every hard choice she had made on every hard day. The accumulated cost of refusing to give up when giving up would have been so much easier. Margaret Greer had once been a woman with nothing left. Now she had everything that mattered, and she had earned every last piece of it.